let's get started. So, consensus starts sometime in the 1980s, arguably, with what perhaps we could call a data center consensus. The mental model at the time is something like, I have an organization, say Google, they have a bunch of machines, they want to have a fault-tolerant service on top, and it's characterized by things like, we're thinking of a few computers, maybe tens of computers, that would engage in such a system. The setup is fairly homogeneous, right? All of these computers probably have the same hardware. The users want the same things from the system. The resources are committed to the system on a long time horizon. The system is fairly static in its configuration. And then most of the work is around, okay, there could be faults in this system, and we want to be able to handle them. Like, say there's like bit flips in the memory of one of these computers. But mostly we think of faults as sort of an exogenous process, right? Similar on the network, right? All of this operates on like private networks within a data center, and maybe every now and then an admin trips over some wire, and then there is like a network partition or something like this. But we think of all of this as sort of comes from the outside of the system. All of these assumptions basically change with blockchain consensus, as we may want to call it. Right now, we're running these systems not within one data center, not within one organization. We're running them at global scale across many different people in different organizations with different incentives, with different interests, in different jurisdictions, across thousands of machines, with very heterogeneous setup. Nodes come and go. The system is very dynamic. There is not just faults, there's ideologic adversaries, there's self-interested parties, and all of this is sort of on the internet, right? And we use overlay networks to communicate, where of course outages may be themselves a result of attack. We talked much about that in the last talk. And so, that's why there's a lot of interesting work to be done in blockchain consensus, why it's not just all stuff from the 1980s. And today I'll be talking I'll be zooming into sort of this aspect of ideologic adversaries, or rather self-interested parties, right? So this is all about this aspect that the nodes are no longer within, inanimate objects within one organization, within a data center, but rather, run by different economic agents, and they have their own interests, and they will pursue them unless we stop them from it. So that's roughly to give you where we are in the high-level picture. And then this is my one slide summary of what you've basically already seen throughout the week, right? We're interested in sort of atomic broadcast consensus. So we have input transactions, they go to our nodes. We have n of them, and their goal is to order these input transactions into output logs, right? Every node produces an output log. This is hard because when nodes run the protocol, they talk to each other, the communication is not perfect. We're assuming partial synchrony for the most part here. So there's this GST, global stabilization time, before which network delay can be arbitrary, and after that, network delay is bounded by delta. And then, of course, not all the nodes are nice and follow the protocol, but f of them can be Byzantine. So that's the setup, and then we want our standard security notions, right? Safety and liveness. Safety is the adversary isn't too strong, say less than n/3 in the partial synchronous setting, then the output logs produced by honest node should always be consistent. And liveness, if f is less than n/3, then all the input transactions, assuming infinite block size, enter the output logs quickly. Okay, what happens if this breaks, right? So what we're interested in now is, so this is under some assumptions on, okay, probably there's not going to be too many faults, but now we're running this in some internet scale. Everybody is their own player, and how do we justify this threshold assumption? Maybe we can't justify this threshold assumption, and so what we're trying to do instead is strengthen. So in this property, right, all bets are off if this threshold assumption happens to be violated. So instead, what we would like to do is we would like to strengthen this notion of safety to a notion called accountable safety, which says, if it's not the case that all the output logs are always consistent, then at least we want to provably identify n/3 Byzantine parties. Okay, so it's important to notice that's a strengthening of the safety property, because if less than n/3 parties are Byzantine, then the only way in which this can be true is that there are no inconsistencies to begin with. Right? So accountable safety means if f is it implies if f is less than n/3, then the output logs are always consistent. But also if the output logs happen to not be consistent, because f is greater than n/3, if something happens, then we can at least find n/3 of the bad guys. Okay. And then the other notion, then you can ask, okay, this is a bit suggestive here, right? We start with two properties. One of them we strengthen. Very natural question, can we do the same thing to the other property? Right? This leads us to this notion of accountable liveness, where we do the same trick, right? We're saying, okay, instead of saying if we have a threshold adversary, then we get liveness, let's turn it around and say, if it happens that transactions aren't confirmed quickly, so there is some transaction that remains unconfirmed for a long time, then we want to be able to identify bad guys. Ideally, n/3, maybe we're not going to be able to do that in this talk, so we'll have to put a pin in this and revisit it, but that would be sort of the aspiration. And then why do we care? So the key notion here is this notion of provably identify, right? So what we want is, we'll talk more about that in detail later, but we want that we will not accidentally identify honest nodes as malicious. Okay? And then what do we do with this? Well, we basically get out of this provable identification a certificate of guilt, right? Some sort of a proof that this set of node is Byzantine, and the idea is we're going to use this certificate of guilt, this proof, to then go and eject or punish these Byzantine nodes. And so the talk today will have these three parts. We'll start with accountable safety, we'll talk about accountable liveness, and then we'll talk about this recovery procedure. Okay. This is interesting because we started here sort of giving like a first principle motivation for why we might be interested in these strength and security properties, but it's actually quite a practical topic, right? If you go back, for example, to Ethereum's Casper paper from 2017, you already find these two notions of slashing and inactivity leak. And if you squint, slashing roughly corresponds to this notion of accountable safety, and inactivity leak perhaps roughly corresponds to this notion of accountable liveness. Right? All right, so let's start with part one. So accountable safety. So our goal here is, what we want is that whenever there's a safety violation in our consensus protocol, we get a certificate of guilt implicating Byzantine nodes. What do we mean by certificate of guilt? Okay, of course, the non-trivial regime to do this is when f is greater than n/3, right? Because if f is less than n/3, then there's no safety violations to begin with. So if we restrict ourselves to f less than n/3, then we can trivially be accountably safe by just being safe, right? So we're interested in making this work whenever the adversary actually exceeds n/3. And what is a certificate of guilt? Think of it as just some string that you can only produce if none of, so a certificate, like a certain string is a certificate of guilt for a certain set of nodes if the only time you can produce that string is in executions in which none of these nodes is honest. Right, so it's a proof that we want to satisfy two properties. One is a soundness property. If you look at the certificate of guilt and you conclude from it a certain set of nodes is malicious, then these nodes should actually be malicious. They should never falsely accuse honest nodes. And the other side to this is we want this to implicate many Byzantine nodes, ideally n/3. Okay. How do we construct this in? We're thinking now partial synchrony, right? So PBFT style protocols. Roughly, you'll see this, but the idea would be if you're given the message histories of two nodes that have inconsistent logs, we can find nodes that have irrefutably voted inconsistently because they voted for sort of two things that they should not have voted for simultaneously. Right? Okay, so roughly how does this work, right? We think of a PBFT style protocol. We will build our blockchain on the left-hand side. We have our nodes. There's some leader. The leader proposes a block. Everybody takes a vote.
If the block gets enough votes, then it can make its way sort of to confirmation. Yeah.
So I have a question about what you mean by we can find. Do you mean somebody looking at the whole transaction history from the outside? Makes sense. Start over. So my question is, what do you mean by we can find n over 3 nodes that are provably guilty? Do you mean somebody looking at the transaction log from the outside, or do you mean the network itself? Because this seems like a big difference.
Good. So one way I think we can answer this is just think of it very practically, right? We're running this blockchain. Somebody is paying somebody else for buying a car, right? And the person who is buying the car and the person who is selling the car have a disagreement over whether they got paid or not. Right? Now that means we have two clients that have inconsistent logs, right? And these two guys go to a judge and say, we have a problem here, help us resolve it. The judge will say, give us all the messages you've received from the network, and then based on these messages, we want to read off the bad guys, right? The judge says, okay, this set of nodes is bad, and what we want is that the judge never falsely accuses or convicts an honest node, and we want the judge to be able to convict enough actually malicious nodes. That would be one way to operationalize that. Okay, back to PBFT style protocols, right? We have a proposal, we have voting, and then we can confirm blocks if they get enough votes, right? And in order to, if we had an inconsistency, right? This is very sort of comic style here, but you'll see that this intuition roughly carries over. If we want both of these conflicting blocks to be confirmed, right, then 2/3 have to have voted for the left block. 2/3 would have to have voted for the right block, right? But there are only 1/3 of votes left. So the only way in which the right-hand side block can also be confirmed is if there is a certain set of nodes that have voted for both, right? And then we can look at these votes and be like, okay, there are some votes here that voted for both blocks. That's against the protocol. And so we can identify the protocol violators. Right? And so these votes are our certificate of guilt. And the guys who sign those votes are protocol violators. Okay? This intuition already hints at two properties that we can get for accountable safety. One is that we can add it to any partially synchronous protocol without making new assumptions, for example, on network delay. And the second property is that we can provide this. It's actually quite a strong property, right? We can provide this no matter how many nodes are Byzantine. Right? It doesn't matter, even if pretty much anybody is Byzantine here, right? They cannot escape the fact that if they want to confuse two users into committing inconsistent stuff, they need to sacrifice n over 3 of the Byzantines to do this equivocation. Right?
I think there is an auto assumption here that every block is backed by a commit certificate, right?
Say again?
Every decision, every block is backed by a commit certificate, right? Because in some blockchains, if you just trust an authority, you cannot find this intersection, right?
Yes, this is in like PBFT style protocols. This doesn't work for some other protocols. Yeah. Okay, and so this intuition that I've here sort of sketched in this comic, we can actually make precise, and it happens in this, as easy as ABC paper, right? Optimal accountable Byzantine consensus is easy, where they achieve exactly this property sort of generically. And the way they do it is with this very simple little algorithm here. They call it the ABC transform. What it basically does is the following. You take your favorite partially synchronous consensus protocol, you put the transactions in, you reach a preliminary decision, and then you run a little bit of extra logic, which is whatever comes out of your partially synchronous base protocol, you will vote once on the first preliminary decision that you see. And then if among those votes you see a quorum of n minus t, then you're going to declare that your actual decision. Okay, and now you get exactly the countable safety property, we can go through how to do that. What's a certificate of guilt here, right? If you want to convince two nodes of inconsistent decisions, right? You have to have two n minus t quorums for both of these decisions. They will intersect in n over 3 nodes. And so that's your certificate of guilt, and that shows the countable safety. That make sense? Okay, how do you go from this single shot case to the multi-shot case? You basically do this on a per height basis of whatever the preliminary decision of your log-based protocol sort of comes, is being produced, right, from the partially synchronous protocol. So your partially synchronous protocol now produces a stream of preliminary decisions, and then for every height, you will vote for the first preliminary decision, but only if it's consistent with the stuff that you voted for at the height before. Okay. The drawback with this construction is the advantages is very simple. The drawback is it costs you another 2 rounds of network communication, and it costs you the votes that you need to be sending. Okay.
Again, in this case, if the second box, the additional communication steps, if the guys equivocate in this case, I mean, I can vote for different preliminary decisions, right?
Sorry, say again?
I can vote for different preliminary decisions if I am additions.
Yes.
So I can create the same situation. So I can make 2 values to be decided if I have a no.
You can, if you have n over 3, if you control more than n over 3 nodes, you can get honest nodes to commit inconsistent decisions, right? But they will be able to identify n over 3 of your bad guys.
If you cannot do that inside consensus, you can do that after consensus.
Yes, yeah. So you cannot stop them from committing inconsistent stuff, but you can find the bad guys after the fact. Right. Okay. Everybody happy so far? Good. So we can avoid this extra latency and the extra communication if we take into account the fact that actually many protocols already give us this property sort of out of their quorum intersection safety argument, in many cases out of the box and basically for free. Okay, I want to show this with the example of the Streamlit protocol. So what Streamlit is a very simplified sort of PBFT style protocol, right? Time proceeds in fixed slots, right? Everybody knows what view we're in at what point in time. From a data structure perspective, we're building a blockchain, so there's blocks. They point to their parent. There is votes on these blocks. A block is considered notarized if it got more than 2/3 of votes. And a chain is notarized if all the blocks in the chain are notarized. I think so far that's quite intuitive. And then within every what they call epoch, which is like one round of the protocol basically, there's a leader at the beginning of the epoch who looks at their longest notarized chain and builds a block on top, broadcasts that to everybody, and then in that epoch, every node takes the first proposal from the right leader that they see that extends any of their longest notarized chains, right, and votes for it. That's it, basically. That's what the protocol is. And then in order to commit, in order to confirm transactions, whenever we see a notarized chain that ends in 3 blocks that are from consecutive epochs, then we take the middle block and confirm this block together with the entire prefix. Okay, that's the protocol. For what we're going to talk about, all we need are these 2 rules, right? The confirm rule and the voting rule. Okay, we want to show that in Streamlit, as is written here, if you have a safety violation, you'll be able to, well, I guess I wrote to what's a contradiction. No, suppose you have a safety violation, right? We'll be able to find n over 3 Byzantine nodes, and we have cryptographic proof of that fact. Okay, so suppose we have 2 nodes that commit inconsistent blocks, right? The way they did that is from the commit rule, right? They had these blocks B1, B2, B3. They came from consecutive epochs, right? There's the competing commit. Maybe I'll explain it over here, then everybody sees better. Okay, so then what must be the case? they can only commit if these blocks lie on notarized chains. Okay, so all of these blocks lie on notarized chains that go back all the way to Genesis. Okay, so this means if without loss of generality we say these guys are at a higher height than B1, B2, B3, there must be a block B that is on the same height as B2, right? That also got committed at the same time as B1 prime, B2 prime. Okay. Now we wanna see what happens here. So because both of these were confirmed, right? We know that we have 2/3 votes on this block, and we have 2/3 votes on the blocks over here, right? The question now is, what epoch is that block B from, right? What is EB, right? It could be E-1 or E+1, or it could be from before E-1 or from after E+1, right? Now the thing is, okay, so suppose EB was from E-1, E, or E+1, right? Then there is an intersection here of n/3 nodes that have voted in the same epoch for both B and for one of the blocks over here. Right? That's against our voting rule, because in the voting rule you only vote once, right? Per epoch you only vote on the first proposal that you're seeing, right? So if EB is from E-1, E, or E+1, then definitely the intersection of the guys who voted for EB and the ones who voted on the competing branch, those have not followed the protocol, and that's our certificate of guilt right there. Right, so now the only other option is, okay, EB is from before E-1 or from after E+1, right? But then what happened is, let's say EB is from before E-1, right? Then that means at EB, right, at some point in time, the honest nodes, the nodes that are in the intersection of the two quorums, right, first voted for a block of at the height of B, right, which means implicitly they have said, I've already seen a longest notarized chain on height of B-1, right? But then later on, they were still willing to vote for the block B1, which is of a lower height, right? Which conflicts the fact that at that later point in time, they can only have seen their longest notarized chain can only have increased, right? So they cannot have voted for B1, right? And then for the E+1 case, sort of what happens if EB is greater than E+1, the same argument applies, just the other way around. Okay? So there's two slashing conditions in Streamlit, and if you squint and you go back to the Casper FFG paper, you'll see that it has exactly the same slashing conditions, right? Which is a node can be slashed, or I have a certificate of guilt for a node if that node either voted for two conflicting blocks or for two different blocks in the same epoch, or if it had this, first it voted for a fairly high block and then later on it voted for a lower block. Sort of vote structure. Okay, so that makes our certificate of guilt for Streamlit. And it turns out that very much this same argument applies to Streamlit, it applies to Casper FFG, it applies to DMBFT, and if you ask your favorite AI you can convert the safety proof of the original simplex protocol into an accountable safety proof for that protocol. Right? It's literally, you take the quorum intersection argument, you need to basically rewrite it a little bit. So for all of these protocols, we get accountable safety without communication overhead, without latency overhead, out of the box for free. What is it that they have in common? Or in other words, when can this property break? The key thing we had here in Streamlit is that in order to find the certificate of guilt from the two conflicting commits, we had to have access for the notarization on this block B, right? That is not part of the commit rule of B1 prime, B2 prime, and B3 prime. Okay, and so in some protocols you don't have this sort of back references that allows you to go find this notarization committee, and then this property can break. Yeah, so it's important that you, if you want to have the accountable safety property in something like Streamlit, you cannot confirm solely based on these 3 adjacent notarized blocks from consecutive epochs. You need to sort of see the entire crypto evidence sort of going that sort of might have prompted nodes to vote for B1 prime, B2 prime, B3 prime in the first place, so that you can identify the parties that have committed the original sin. Right? The guys who voted down here can always later on say, oh, I was just building on other blocks that I've seen notarized from other people. Right? So you need to find this notarization here, and that can be missing. So if nodes are voting based on earlier votes, right, then enough of these precursor votes, this is intuition basically, need to be required for confirmation, so that when you have conflicting confirmations, you can extract this certificate of guilt. And there's a recent paper in Usenix 2025 that sort of generically uses this intuition and extends protocols confirmation rules to do exactly that. Okay. So the key takeaways from this subsection here are the definition. When we have a safety violation, we want to produce a certificate of guilt implicating n/3 Byzantine nodes. We can actually do that. The way we get that certificate of guilt is we derive it from quorum intersection safety arguments. The safety accountability can be made independent of network timing, can be made independent of number of Byzantine nodes. In fact, you should think of it that way. If somebody gives you a protocol where that is not the case, then you should be skeptic. You should ask why that has to be like that. And then many PBFT-style protocols are accountably safe out of the box. Generic constructions can make PBFT-style protocols accountably safe with this extra overhead of a round of voting. We have seen that. An open problem is there a fully generic construction that avoids that overhead? Right? So if you want to sink your teeth into something, go ahead. I'll have summary slides of all the open problems later on. Okay, so this concludes the first part. Are there any questions? Yes.
I saw the ABC template that you said, take any consensus protocol and the top of it, that is the certificates, and you can basically bring this certificate of guilt from that, right? Does it also count for these interactive consistency protocols that have where you agree on indifferent leaders' input simultaneously?
Yeah, I think you can use the same construction on top of that, right? Just whatever sort of set is agreed there, you just vote on that, and then if two users commit inconsistent sets, then you'll be able to find out who must have double voted.
Okay. I just was wondering if tied something to a single leader. I was just wondering if that compiler on top that you put, it's related to a single leader consensus protocol.
Oh no! It works with it works if you have like common set decisions. Like it works for. They say that in the paper even. It works for a whole bunch of consensus-ish tasks.
Another question I had was, I know you said it's only voting for blocks and proposals and rights, but in general, when you use during periods of network instability, can you also account for parties voting for different leaders or something when you're trying to elect a new leader during the view change? Or is that not what you model in according to the safety?
Can we account for? So, how do I answer this best? I mean, there's on the one hand, there is sort of the liveness question that comes with this, right? So here we're not at all concerned with liveness, right? It doesn't matter, like, for this kind of quorum intersection sort of safety arguments, right? We don't need an honest leader, right? They always work. They're just a result of intersection among the votes cast by our committee, right? It doesn't really matter sort of what they cast their votes on. The only thing that matters is if there's equivocation by the leader, then honest nodes can only vote once. Right? That's often the invariant that we're using to do the accountability, even the safety argument, right? That's the invariant we're using for the safety argument and for the accountability then.
Maybe what I'm asking maybe is a liveness question, not a safety question.
Yes. Without any overhead. With minimal overhead. Maybe, yeah, maybe, or change the existing messages. Yeah, so it's a bit intentionally vague. Sort of, another way maybe you can read it is like minimize any overhead that could come with this, right? So we have the ABC transform. There we know, we have to send a new round of votes. That means overhead in communication, overhead in latency, and so we'd like to shave that off, right, as much as possible. Say again? Depends. Today, maybe yes. Maybe in the future, no longer.
So that would also for non-consensus but broadcast-based protocol.
Yeah. That is one result that I think they have in the ABC paper, or at least there are some other papers from the same set of authors where they show that this works fairly broadly, not just for atomic broadcast. Yeah.
I don't know if you're addressing that in the next section, but we probably want to prove the misbehavior of nodes before it's violations of standard, right? If someone equivocates, you want the slash then to remove that from the validator set before.
Yeah, so this goes a little bit into the question of what should we think about slashing at the point where we don't have the safety violation yet, right? And so I think, historically that has been what blockchains have implemented, right? People have put these mechanisms in place saying, if you cast these kind of votes, you are doing funny business, like you're giving us cryptographic proof that you're not following the protocol. And even if it's only you doing this, and so it's not enough to sort of rise to the level of a safety violation, maybe we want to slash you anyway, right? So that is something that happens in practice that many protocols implement. And that's where historically this sort of comes from. And the way I see this line of works is sort of trying to make rigorous sort of what's the goal of this sort of operation, right? Other than just, we're adding this special mechanism and now we go and take away people's stake because we're sort of skeptic about their intentions because they're giving us proof of like misbehavior. Sort of trying to make rigorous what exactly does that mean, right? And so one way to make that rigorous is to say, okay, the goal behind all of this is to strengthen the safety property with this accountability feature, right? And so then what you get is that, okay, if it ever rises to the level of a consistency violation, you can definitely find these bad guys. That's a good property to have. And then nothing stops you from taking the same slashing rules and applying them even if you don't have a consistency violation.
Yeah, just notice that the 1/3 of the errors is an assumption, right?
Yeah, it's just saying,
we are making strong the assumption by removing guys that obviously are violating your rules.
Like we're saying, if the adversary is not strong, then the consensus protocol works as intended, and we want something extra from this protocol, right? We want that. Okay, is this the end of it? Is there nothing else we can do if the adversary exceeds the threshold? And the answer is no. There is something more we can do, namely we can slash the guys, or we can identify them and then do reconfiguration. We'll see that in the third one.
There was some difference between if the adversary controls more than 2/3.
Oh, good. We'll get to there. So I'll say this in two things. We'll see some of that reappear in part 3, where this will play a role. This is also present in some of the literature on accountable safety. But it is for protocols that are not don't have great accountable safety, right? I think one goal to take away from the first part is that your standard sort of presumption should be, or what you should expect from a protocol, is that it does not have the restriction that you can only identify bad guys if the adversary is less than 2/3. Some protocols have the property that you cannot out of the box identify bad guys if the adversary exceeds 2/3. But what I tried to do with the Streamlit example is to show you that even very simple protocols, right, you get that property. So if you can get it for so cheaply, why shouldn't you always insist on getting it, right? And so if somebody comes and says, I have a consensus protocol for you, it can find bad guys, but only if the adversary is not too strong, then you should be skeptic, because the generic construction gives you that you can find bad guys all the time. And even many of the protocols out of the box allow you to find bad guys all the time. So why would you settle for that? Okay, cool. Yes, yeah. Exactly where I wanted to be timing-wise. 3 minutes slower. So we'll make up for that. So we're going to part 2, accountable liveness. This part of the talk is mostly based on a recent CCS paper of ours with Luca, with Tim, and with Andy, who are also here. So now you've seen the playbook, sort of the accountable playbook for the safety property, and I'll lean heavily on this to, we're trying to do the same for the liveness property, okay, right? So what do we want? We want accountable liveness. What's accountable liveness? It's whenever there's a liveness violation, can we produce some sort of certificate of guilt implicating Byzantine nodes? Again, the non-trivial regime here is that f is greater than n over 3. Otherwise, there are no liveness violations to begin with. Ideally, we would like this mechanism too to be sound and never falsely accuse honest nodes. We'll have to revisit to what extent that's possible. And ideally, we want that mechanism too to implicate many Byzantine nodes, ideally n over 3. We'll see that, at least with the technique that we have in the paper, n over 3 doesn't work, but we can implicate many Byzantine nodes. So that's another pin we have to revisit, and a mental note you might want to make of future work in this area. Okay, so intuitively, how might one go about constructing a certificate of guilt for liveness accountability? This is a bit more tricky than for safety accountability, because we now need to prove the absence of expected messages, missing votes, rather than the presence of unexpected messages, namely equivocating votes, right? So when we have a safety violation, there were so many messages, so many votes that it was enough of them to get 2 nodes to commit inconsistent logs. If we have a liveness violation, what that means is there are proposals and they're not getting quorum, right? There is a leader who is putting out blocks, but then somehow not enough nodes are voting for that, right? And so somehow for a liveness violation, we need to prove the absence of messages that should have been sent, rather than the presence of unexpected messages, and that's what makes it tricky. And the method we're gonna, or the approach we're gonna take is the idea that we'll convict a node for a liveness violation. We're gonna consider them guilty if enough other nodes have witnessed that node not voting for blocks that it ought to have voted for. Okay, that's gonna be sort of the intuition that we'll be following. And the TLDR, you'll see in a moment, is accountable liveness is harder than accountable safety, right? Because of this trickiness, and many of you probably already get a sense that, okay, this sort of intuition seems to require some synchrony, seems to require that, that enough nodes are honest, etc. So yeah, we have seen these 2 properties for accountable safety, right? That we can add it to partially synchronous protocols without new assumptions, for example, on the network delay. In the paper, there's a theorem that shows that no protocol can have accountable liveness if the network is more often asynchronous than synchronous. And thus, in particular, also not under partial synchrony. Okay, so there is some minimum amount of synchrony required. We can prove that. And it's just because a very, very unreliable network by itself may be the only reason why you see a liveness violation, right? Even it could be everybody is honest, and yet the network just doesn't deliver the votes in time, and so that alone is the reason for the liveness violation. Yeah.
What would happen if it was not bad? Would it then accuse somebody of doing something bad? If you have more async than sync?
Yeah, so if you have this mechanism, so I think that's one of the reasons why the inactivity leak on Ethereum, for example, is much more gentle on nodes than the slash sharing mechanism, precisely because there's some sort of a synchrony assumption there. We can debate about this synchrony assumption. We'll see in a moment sort of how we resolve that. The real world seems to have some synchrony to it, at least on long enough timescales, right? So maybe some sort of an assumption there is, for long enough timescales is sort of justified. But yeah, if you have a slashing mechanism for liveness violations, and really the only reason why you're not seeing liveness is because the network is bust, then you'll eventually start slashing honest nodes.
Can I ask for a moment?
And let me say one more sentence on this, and that's inherent, right? So that's for this mechanism, and that's for all the other mechanisms too. That's basically what the theorem says, right? You can't do better.
How do you formally define a liveness violation?
We'll get to that in a moment. So it's a little bit different from the, we'll get to that. Okay, and then the other thing we've seen about accountable safety earlier is that we can provide it no matter how many nodes are Byzantine. And for accountable liveness, again, we have a theorem. A similar version of the theorem has already appeared earlier, where we can prove that no protocol can simultaneously provide accountable liveness when f is greater than half, right? Even assuming synchrony, right? As long as that protocol also guarantees some minimum form of safety under partial synchrony, right? Even if everybody is honest, and only the network is asynchronous, then the protocol needs to, if the protocol then guarantees safety, then this protocol cannot have accountable liveness. Okay, and the intuition, this is a formal version of the intuition that if you have enough Byzantine nodes, at some point they can start framing honest nodes, right? They can among themselves sort of run their own little execution where everything is nice and dandy, and then just say, okay, it's the honest guys who are not playing ball here, let's go slash them. Right. And again, this is, it'd be nice if the world wasn't like this, but like every mechanism will have this property. So what do we mean by the network is more often asynchronous than synchronous? For this, in the paper, we have this notion of x partial synchrony. I'll give you a sort of a little image of what that means, right? So in synchrony, we have that at all times the network delay is bounded by delta. In partial synchrony, we have this GST, and after that, the network delay is bounded by delta, and before that, the network delay is arbitrary. And in x partial synchrony, with some parameter x between 0 and 1, we also have GST, and after GST, network delay is bounded by delta. But before GST, if we partition time into windows, something like in the order of hours, and further subdivide the windows into a smaller quantum of, call them views, right? Something in the order of seconds, we get the property that at least an 1 minus x fraction of the views in every window guarantees the network delay bound, right? So the network here is like, more often synchronous than asynchronous. Okay, this makes sense? Okay. And notice, right, x partial synchrony is sort of a interpolation between synchrony, which is 0x partial synchrony, and partial synchrony, which is like 1x partial synchrony. So that's something.
Can you imagine other ways? So like you're going to motivate by this?
No, this is the way we chose. For other network models, there may be other impossibilities, and there may be other possibilities. But with this parameterization of the network, right, with this explanation for what we mean by majority asynchronous execution, right, we have no hope for accountable liveness if either the adversary is greater than n over 3, if the execution is majority asynchronous, or if the adversary is greater than half, even if we had synchrony. Right? And at the same time, accountable liveness is sort of not interesting. It's vacuous if f is less than n over 3 in majority synchronous execution. So the best we can sort of hope for is let's get accountable liveness in scenarios where f is less than n over 2 and the execution, the network is majority synchronous.
I guess I wonder if you could get like a less strong technique. You have like a set of online clients, even if you have so many, basically there's like maybe a small minority. And the clients that are listening to that minority,
Maybe. Maybe. So the main result of the paper is that this is in fact the case, right? So within this model, those are our constraints, and it's a if and only if characterization of how we can get accountable liveness. Yeah.
Yeah, I understood the notion of quantifying synchrony and asynchrony measure like time, but there are a series of works where you can look at not look at the network as a monolith, but quantify the level of synchrony in the connections between parties. I think granular synchrony is one of them. I think it also plays some with what Patrick was describing in the last talk, where the network is basically implemented by the parties, and so they give you used to some form of TCP or something to build basic temperature delivery guarantees. So I was wondering if you can introduce a definition like that in this case, where the majority of links are synchronous, others making progress, but because of a denial of service attack or something on one of the parties, the entire guarantee breaks down because you're trying to define the network as a big monolith, even if one party is synchronous.
Yeah, I think maybe we should add to the list of open problems is to study this problem in different network models, right? That's basically so. These results are for this one network model. If you change the network model, then you may get different results. Yeah. To us, this network model seemed like a natural thing to do. In some sense, it's a mix of synchrony and asynchrony on a time scale. I understand you could do granular synchrony. It's like a mix of synchrony and asynchrony on a space scale, right? On a node scale rather than on a time scale. Yeah. Okay, good. So the main result is we can take a protocol like Tendermint and other PBFT style protocols and give them the following, augment them so that they satisfy the following property. Right? As usual, if f is less than n over 3, then this is a perfectly fine partially synchronous protocol. It's safe and it's live after GST with order delta expected latency under partial synchrony. And it has an extra functionality, which is if f happens to be less than n over 2, and the network happens to be x partially synchronous for x less than half, then this protocol is accountably live. Okay, so you get what you got from the original protocol with some extra property on top. Okay, how does it work? You start from something like Tendermint. This is the comic version of it, right? There is a view change, a leader makes a proposal, and then we do 2 rounds of voting. And you augment each of these rounds. You add some logic to each view, right? All nodes rebroadcast all the messages that they receive, and they monitor the messages that they receive from other nodes. Right? The messages that they, if a node P observes a node Q failing to send a message that it should have sent, assuming synchrony, then P blames Q for that particular view V. Right, so what's the idea here? The idea is that in Tendermint, for example, right, there will be a proposal by the leader. If you don't see liveness, it means that this proposal does not get if this was an honest leader, the adversary cannot vote for it, otherwise you have liveness. Right? So there must be votes missing. Right? And now the question is, are the votes missing because this was not a valid proposal? Or are the votes missing because this was a valid proposal, but the adversary nodes have not voted for it? Right? And in order to decide that, you need to know sort of what catch-up message, what lock the node has seen. right? What the leader has built on, right? Is this a valid proposal or not? And the way you get that is by rebroadcasting all the received messages and monitoring which node has seen what message, right? And then you can say, hey, you send like, your lock to the leader. I saw that. You gave it to me. I forwarded it to the leader, right? So the leader had it. I see that, according to what you sent me, this was should have been a valid proposal for you. You didn't vote for this, so then you get blamed. Yeah.
The question here is that can mean also if you receive an invalid proposal, you vote even for invalid stuff. You vote even if it.
Yeah, this depends a bit on the version of Tender. In our version of Tendermint, you don't. But yeah, sure.
Does it mean that you cannot have that in a protocol in really one media? It's rebroadcast.
Yeah, that's one of the open problems I have on my list. Is this is, as it's written here, is horribly inefficient. If you're on a gossip-based network for your blockchain, then it's not that horribly inefficient. It basically does that automatically for you anyway. But yeah, if you're in like point-to-point model, then reducing the communication complexity of this is an open problem.
So it's unclear if it's possible to have it in OM. Not it's useful, but I'm just saying it's unclear if it's possible.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is what blame is, right? And then nodes exchange information about who they blamed at what point in time. And if a transaction remains unconfirmed for long, so this is going back to the question earlier, what do we mean by not live? By not live, we mean, so traditionally, right, liveness means eventually every transaction is confirmed. In that sense, in the strict sense, you cannot tell at any one point in time whether the protocol is not live, right? Because the transaction may still be confirmed in the future. So what we do here is we say, okay, there is a certain deadline, right? If there is a certain deadline, and if your transaction remains unconfirmed for too long, right, then we say, okay, the protocol is no longer live, and now we can identify that as. Okay. So if a transaction remains unconfirmed for long, it means that all the honestly proposed blocks during that time did not get a quorum. And then we can use these blame counts to identify nodes as guilty based on that collective blame accounting. Okay, and we'll see in a moment how. Okay, so why may it be that there is a liveness violation in Tendermint? Well, it could be asynchrony, just the proposal didn't make it to nodes in time to vote for it. It could be non-participation, so withholding of votes by Byzantine nodes. Or it could be some sort of shenanigans by the Byzantine leader, right? Like delaying a proposal, not sending the proposal to everybody, those kind of things. For the moment, we'll shelve point 3. We'll revisit it in a moment. Let's assume that the leader is honest. Let's assume all the leaders are honest. Right? And suppose a Tendermint view fails to confirm transactions. Right? This has an honest leader, so there is a proposal that has all the unconfirmed transactions, and yet they don't get confirmed in this view. If it's a synchronous view, by our assumption, this happens more often than asynchrony, right? Then honest nodes do not blame each other, right? There is a proposal. It's a synchronous view, so this proposal makes it to all the honest nodes in time. All the honest nodes will vote for it, and they monitor each other, send messages, and they say, yes, you got a proposal. It was a valid proposal for you. You should have voted for it. You did vote for it. No reason to blame you. Right? However, this thing didn't get a quorum, right? And because it's a synchronous view, everybody knows that this was a valid proposal, and yet it didn't get a quorum. It didn't get 2/3 of votes. So there must be n/3 nodes that didn't vote for this, right? And all the honest nodes, which by assumption is more than n/2, will then blame these Byzantine nodes that haven't voted for the proposal. Okay, so those Byzantine nodes are majority blamed, meaning blamed by more than half of the nodes, because they're blamed by all the honest nodes for that view. Okay, and what happens in an asynchronous view? Well, Luckily, that happens less often than synchrony, but there all bets are off, right? Honest nodes will blame each other. The adversary may put even more blame on top. At the same time, honest nodes may not blame adversary nodes, etc. Right? All bets are off. Okay, our goal is, let's find a node that is guilty. Let's consider a node guilty that is majority blamed in a majority of views. Right? That's the idea, and we're going to show that. So that's the idea of how we decide that a node is guilty based on the blame accounting. Okay. The good news is no honest node will ever be found guilty, because to be found guilty, a node has to be blamed by a majority in a majority of the views. The majority of the views are synchronous. Honest nodes don't blame honest nodes in synchronous views, right? So it can only be the adversary blaming them in those views, and that's not a majority. So they cannot be majority blamed in a majority of the views. Okay. The bad news is we can't guarantee that any Byzantine node can be found guilty by this simple rule. Again, the good news is there is a way of restricting this idea to a specially selected subset of views where we can then use a cute combinatorial argument to guarantee that we can actually find guilty nodes. That's a bit too involved to show here, so check out the paper if you want to understand that argument. But that's the key idea is find a node guilty that is majority blamed in a majority of views. That gives you quite some mileage. Yeah?
The adversary gets to choose which views are asynchronous and which are synchronous.
Yes, subject to the X partial synchrony constraint.
But typically protocols require a few consecutive views to be synchronous to make progress.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about this Tendermint version that we have in the paper. There, as soon as you have an honest leader, you're good. You'll see commits.
So this kind of technique doesn't work for Streamlit, for example?
Yeah, in Streamlit you would have to make some modifications to the protocol, or you would have to consider as your notion of a view on the network model, longer periods within which it's guaranteed that you can confirm if you have an honest leader. Yeah. In fact, we still have to revisit that point 3, right? What do we do if we have leader shenanigans, right? If the leader is malicious. The idea, again, see the paper for details, is we'll take a bunch of these views and batch them into super views so that we can be sure that at least one honest leader is in every super view. Right? And then we run the same argument. All the blame accounting will happen on a super view basis rather than on a per view basis. And we know that in every super view there's at least one proposal that would have made progress unless it didn't get a quorum. And then that gives us that for that super view, the adversary will be majority blamed again. So that's similar to the question that you're asking. Yeah.
I guess another related question is, so if I take just Tendermint, there is some, after GST, there is some liveness period. So given an honest leader, you will commit a new block in 3 left. Is the period for accountable liveness increased? So you can only blame validators if a block is not committed in exactly the same 3 delta, or?
Oh yeah. The liveness accountability requires you to do this over a whole bunch of, over a period of time that corresponds to these windows that we have seen earlier in the network model, right? So only if you have seen enough views that you can be sure that at least 1 minus x fraction of them must have been synchronous, right? Only then will you start identifying Byzantine nodes. This sort of corresponds also to what we see in practice, right? If you go to the inactivity leak mechanism, it's this sort of mechanism where, if most of your votes make it, then nothing happens to you. But if almost none of your votes make it, and there's also many other people whose votes don't make it, then the leak becomes stronger. And all of this plays out not over the time scale of seconds or minutes, which is the notion of time in Casper FFG, but days or weeks or something like that, right? And so the idea here would be that, yes, it may be that some of your views may be asynchronous, but maybe on a time scale of a week, probably your network will be, more often than not synchronous. That is sort of the, the practical motivation for this network model. We learned after writing the paper, it seems that people actually buy internet, like commercial internet that way. Like they go to their ISP and the sort of performance metrics that they get is that 90% of the time you'll see packet loss less than this and this rate, and so that corresponds actually quite nicely to this network model.
Yeah, question also the concept of view in dynamic, the version of dynamic is high, around, or below? The original dynamic.
Here it's sort of similar to this notion of an epoch that we have seen in Streamlit before, right? So a view is just like it's not think of it as a round, yeah. Think of it as a round. Yeah.
So if you need to do something you don't do in dynamic, that's distant to message from previous heights and one, right? In order to, because they are rebroadcast, so I need to keep track of.
Yeah, so the rebroadcasting only happens sort of within that view, right? So the idea is that
you have to receive within the view the message from the view. So if you move to view +1, you don't care about the message from view B.
No, the entire time you just keep track of who sends you what message.
Even the message.
Yeah, the entire time you keep track of that, right? And then what you can basically see is that over a long time horizon, right? The assumption is that most of these views are synchronous, right? And so you're going to run this argument of like, okay, what are the view change messages I have seen, right? What are the locks that were given to the leader based on which the leader was supposed to make a valid proposal that everybody can vote for, right? And then I compare that to, okay, what did the leader actually propose? Did people actually vote for, what they said they would be voting for, right? Based on what they sent to the leader, and then you do this comparison, and the insight is that during synchronous views, this argument will basically work, right? The only way in which the block doesn't get a quorum is if there are votes missing, right? And if there are votes missing, but the network is synchronous, then you'll see that these guys got a valid proposal that they should have voted for, but they didn't vote for it.
That's right. So if you use the original algorithm where you vote for new instead of being silent, it works the same. So you're punishing the guys that vote for new.
Yeah, you would do. Yeah, I think you can do the same there, right? Whether they don't vote or they vote for nil, even though they should have voted for the value, then you can also punish them. Yeah, same argument. Okay, so that concludes that argument. As I said, there's a few details we left out, but you can find them in the paper. The key takeaways for this part, again, the definition, liveness of accountable liveness is if there is a liveness violation, we want to have a certificate of guilt implicating Byzantine nodes. The certificate of guilt is made up of like nodes attesting to roughly unexcused absent votes. This notion of accountable liveness is unachievable when f is greater than half, even under synchrony, and when f is greater than n/3 under x partial synchrony with x greater than half. On the flip side, it's achievable whenever that's not the case. You can modify any pretty much standard PBFT style protocols to achieve this. Open problems here are more. Increase the number of Byzantine nodes found guilty after a liveness violation, improve latency, improve communication complexity. We said earlier, go to different network models, ask for a generic construction of getting this. So that concludes part 2. We're a little bit 5 minutes behind, but we'll do part 3. So then what, right? Now we want to do recovery. What do we do with these certificates of guilt? We use them to eject and punish Byzantine nodes, right? So we slash their stake. If we're in a proof of stake blockchain, we eject them from the consensus committee. And the hope is if we clean up our consensus committee, then we'll be able to resume doing consensus. That's sort of the high-level idea that has been around for a while. In Ethereum, sometimes it's called, this is a part of what's called social consensus. The literature has a few approaches on how to go about this. In this part 3, I'll be following this recent Beyond Optimal Fault Tolerance paper from Tim and Andy. And we'll only consider safety violations here. Okay, I don't think anybody has spelled this out for liveness violations yet. So what do we want this? Okay, so the idea is we're running this partially synchronous protocol, and we're going to augment it with this recovery procedure. What do we want that overall combination to behave like? We want that if the adversary is less than n/3, this should just behave like a regular partially synchronous consensus protocol. But if there is a safety violation, which means that at least in some executions where f is greater than n/3, we want to do recovery. What do we mean by recovery? Within a bounded recovery time, honest nodes should no longer witness safety violations. And transactions may be rolled back, right? We saw inconsistent logs, so we somehow have to reconcile this, right? But we want to make sure that there is a bounded rollback time. So only transactions that were confirmed recently can be rolled back during recovery. Transactions that were confirmed a while ago, we want to have the guarantee that they will stick around even during recovery. Okay. For the bounded rollback time, I'll say two things. I think it's quite intuitive from a practical perspective why you might want that. And from a theoretical perspective, if you take away that property, then the problem changes considerably, and some of the impossibility results no longer hold. So maybe that's interesting to look at. So here's the bummer, right? This notion of recovery, especially the bounded rollback, cannot be satisfied if either we're in partial synchrony or if f is greater than 2/3, even if we assume some form of synchrony and we're okay with recovery and rollback time scaling in that time parameter. So this is the threshold coming back that Itai asked about earlier. This threshold will come back one more time. Okay, so we know we can't do that. So for recovery, we will assume that f is less than 2/3. And we will assume this delta star synchrony model, which is a variant of partial synchrony, where before GST, the delay is bounded by this delta star, and after GST, the delay is bounded by delta. And you should think of delta as the usual, hundreds of milliseconds, perhaps, delay of network communication speed under good circumstance. And you should think of delta star in the order of like hours or days, right? This is the out-of-band sort of social communication speed. I will say one more point on this, right? So we're making some sort of a synchrony assumption here. We know already from earlier works that we need some form of synchrony anyway if we want to do something like slashing, right? Because we have our nodes, they staked their tokens in order to run the protocol. We want to go slash them, but they can be unstaking and leave the system and thereby evade our slashing. And so if we don't want that to happen, we need to make sure that if there is inconsistency, we notice that while they're still staked so that we can take away their stake. That's weak subjectivity on Ethereum. That was a question.
So I've not read the paper, but is it all based on fairly generic protocols and generic assumptions? Or ones that actually build with a specific 3+1 protocol in mind, which means that potentially the game may change if the protocol is like Solana 60+20+20 or the higher.
This is fairly generic for traditional sort of optimally resilient partial synchronous protocols, right?
What is optimal resilience? So maybe that whole thing may change for the 5+1 planet?
Yeah, you can revisit that question.
Okay.
Put it on the open problem.
Okay, cool. Potentially it's more urgent to recover from the, let's say, weaker problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is an open problem. Okay, good. So these are our assumptions, right? And under these assumptions, here is the interesting insight, right? If f is less than 2/3, then if you remove n/3 Byzantine nodes, which you get from your certificate of guild, then what you're left with is an honest majority, right? If these are my nodes, here's the thirds, right? I know that less than 2/3 are Byzantine, meaning more than 1/3 is honest. If I remove a third Byzantine nodes, right, I'm left with an honest majority. And that's kind of nice because we have some form of a synchrony assumption here. And under synchrony, we can run consensus if we have an honest majority, right? So the idea would be that we'll be running the recovery essentially with roughly a synchronous a synchronous consensus protocol. Okay. Here's how the construction looks like, right? We run our partially synchronous protocol with, this is at Genesis, right? So the Genesis log G is the empty log. The set of parties is everybody, right? And this protocol makes confirmations. For example, it confirms log L1. And if that log stays around, uncontested, there's no competing inconsistent commit for a while, to delta star in fact, right? Then we know that this log will stay around basically after recovery, right? Because the whole thing here is that the recovery preserves bounded rollback, and and the bounded rollback here is 2 delta star in this protocol. Right, so this log, this protocol is happily making progress, confirming logs. At some point, there are 2 logs L3 and L4 that, close by in time, it becomes clear that there is a safety violation. Then we're going to kick into recovery mode, and we're going to roughly run a synchronous protocol. And we're going to give to that synchronous protocol all the logs that we have seen confirmed for a long time. Yeah. And the certificate of guilt that we get from the accountable safety property. Yeah, and then we run that synchronous protocol. The idea here is that we basically want to agree on a Genesis log based on, to which we roll the chain back and on where we then resume consensus. And we want to agree on which certificate of guilt we're going to use in order to clean up our consensus committee. There's a little bit of a tweak, right? How do you do that, right? Everybody has seen some certificate of guilt. It's not clear that everybody has seen the same certificate of guilt. We know that whatever certificate of guilt you use to remove adversary parties from your committee, you end up with an honest majority, but it's not clear that if nodes don't agree on the committee, they can run consensus. There is a nice trick in the paper on how to do that. Basically, you run a synchronous protocol, somebody makes a proposal, and then whatever they propose as the certificate of guilt, that's what you're going to use to sort of temporarily remove from your committee for that particular decision round. Right? And then at some point you have a decision on which log you're going to resume the consensus with and which nodes you're going to remove, and then you restart your partially synchronous consensus protocol. Any questions on this? Okay, then let me wrap up. So this is, there are some other recovery works. Check them out, ZLB and this recent Usenix 2025 paper. The Beyond Optimal Fault Tolerance paper you should see as sort of one side of the story, kind of the distributed computing side of the story. There is the kind of economic side of the story of slashing and accountability, which you can find in this economic limits of permissionless consensus paper. Key takeaways from this part is we're going to use a certificate of guilt to slash and eject Byzantine nodes and then resume consensus. That's the goal. Bounded rollback requires some form of synchrony and that f is less than 2n/3. The synchrony assumption is perhaps okay because we require that for slashing anyway. There is this generic regular consensus protocol plus recovery consensus protocol construction that we talked about. And in terms of open problems, recover from liveness violation would be one of them, for example. Key papers, I guess we'll have the slides distributed at some point, so you guys can check that out. I have some lists. And then this is the summary of open problems. I'll just leave this up as we're answering any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. So from a purely performance standpoint, right, like I understood that you need to have only one view every delta seconds, capital delta seconds, to make sure that 1/6 partitions are
So you're in the recovery protocol. So
in the liveness protocol, when you're taking tendament or something, you want one view every delta seconds, right? Is that
you want one view, so your protocol will have some view schedule, right? So for the variant of Tendermint we use, the views are 4 delta long, and so that's fine. Right?
Okay, so in general in practice, the lesser you set delta the higher the probability that the view is going to be partially synchronous and synchronous, right? Let's say you set capital delta as 1 second, that X fraction is going to reduce.
Right.
And if you set it to be lower, or like say 100 milliseconds or 200 or something.
Yeah. The way we do this in the paper is there's some function that basically tells you if you want views of this and this length, how long do you have to choose your window, so the number of views you're considering, such that you're guaranteed this 1 minus X fraction. Yeah. So that's that in order to express exactly this intuition that, right, there's some sort of a function that if I have a consensus protocol that has very short views, right, probably I don't need that many of these views to sort of be convinced that 1 minus X fraction of them satisfies a synchrony, right? And if I have longer views, then okay, maybe I need to wait longer time.
Okay, so if we can quantify that overhead, for example, like how much you have to increase data in response to these, they are the optimistic protocols that get confirmed with network scale, right? So
yeah.
Is there a way to quantify that?
Yeah, so we don't, so our construction, we don't do for responsive protocols. We have a fixed view schedule in mind. Bringing that to responsive protocols would be interesting, yeah.
Another thing I wanted to confirm was if f greater than n by 3, for example, you can assume partial synchronous view, and f is greater than n by 3, and those parties somehow they relinquish the entire notion of blockchain or something, right? Like they take some extremely uncooperative set of parties who have this much amount of stake. So since the network, you require the delta star assumption on recovery, basically. So say these parties are not willing to cooperate and there is no way you can restore synchrony anyway, right? Then it is no way recoverable.
You're asking what happens if the synchrony assumption doesn't work?
Yeah, like in practice, in general, like how do you make sure synchrony holds? Like
Yeah. So I think the sort of the practical response to that is that there's like different communication networks in some sense, right? So it's true that if you run like a gossip network, and then if too many of the nodes in the gossip network are Byzantine, then maybe the gossip network by itself does not give you good properties anymore, right? But if that happens, then you're an admin, you get really angry, you take to crypto Twitter and you go talk to your friends that like there must be Byzantine guys around, and now you're basically talking on like Twitter network, and that's maybe a little slower because it's like humans talking to humans, but like there is some form of synchrony there, right? So that would be like maybe a practical defense of that model.
Thank you.
Just to add to what you said, right? In practice, cloud. So in practice, cloud providers will give you some sort of an SLA in terms of you're going to get so much bandwidth and so much time and so much latency and so much time and so on, right? So they will give you some 2 nines, 3 nines or protects, and that can be used in practice if you're using the cloud.
Yeah, so you may not be sufficiently certain that you will always get like hundreds of milliseconds of latency, right? But maybe you can be very, very certain that you will always be able to communicate at the order of like, if your network goes down, then it'll be recovered by your ISP within 3 hours or something.
Do you have any intuition or feeling about possible lower bounds on communication complexity of accountable liveness?
I have not thought about it. That's a good question. I need to edit my slides here live.
So where it is going to work is so on the past, we more specifics of what other actors be done with safety.
Oh yes, very good, very good. So one thing I had in mind when I wrote this, right, is that recently people are interested in things like censorship resistance, for example, for consensus protocols, right? If we want to run markets on consensus protocols, we need some form of censorship resistance. And then, maybe you want to have some slashing or some accountability for that, right? Or if you, another important property we heard about encrypted mempools yesterday, right, is we want to have encryption. We want to have our transactions encrypted until they're confirmed. And sometimes there are threshold assumptions there. And if they're violated, what can we do, right? Can we, this goes to like whistleblowing and these kind of trader tracing protocols where, can we at least hold the guys accountable who have not followed the protocol?
Let's thank you again.